We'll talk if you like. I tell you right out, I'm a man who likes talking to a man who likes to talk.
Well, we're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings from Tbilisi, Georgia. This is Byrne, the Anadromist, on a nice, calm, overcast day here in Georgia. And, looking out this one window, and I have a big plant that I'm growing in it, and the other window has a cat sitting above the heater. It's getting whatever heat it can on this. It's not that cold here. So, time to answer Q&A questions. I must say this. You folks did a really great job of asking questions. I had to cut it off early because the questions they were all too dense and deep. Oh, it's nice to know people have those kinds of questions because we live in a culture where everyone says that essentially we are all very shallow. And thank you for proving we are not. I think that's one of the interesting things Jordan Peterson pointed out is that, people are watching his 2.5 hour lectures and such. Well, this goes against the concept of people only wanting sound bites. Well, yeah, there are still people who want sound bites, but it's not everybody. And if there's anybody who doesn't, I'm on board with that. That, to me, is a hopeful sign. So we'll start there. So, questions. I've tried to arrange these questions in some sort of order that makes sense. So I put all the music questions together, the time questions together, and I've tried to, we're going to start with the things like arts and culture and move on to the more philosophical and finally end with a couple of practical questions at the end. So let's start with music. Someone called Crowley445 gave me the following question. He says, I have a question of personal importance that may be still relevant to your channel. What is modern music for? Mere entertainment or something more meaningful? The modern musician is said to be motivated by self-expression. Is this anything but the creation of idols that celebrate the ego? What is the role of the modern artist more generally? To contribute to the meaning crisis by adding to the flood of entertainment that hinders meaningful attention? Or maybe to create cracks of freedom and point to a world beyond mere entertainment? And then he tries to say, well, what do I mean by modern entertainment? And he says, I mean genres that originate in or characterize the 20th century. And let me first say, that's a huge, huge, huge question. So forgive me if I don't answer it completely. And it's a huge question for me because I know my music history pretty well, and there's a lot of room to move in there. But the first big question is, what does he mean by modern music? And as he says, he means genres that originated or characterized the 20th century, and by that also the 21st century, I'm sure. Well, there are two possible answers to what modern music is. The first is what we would call modernist music. Modernist music is the line of classical music that starts in the music of, say, someone like Schoenberg, and then moves on through people like George Crumb or Pierre Boulez. You get people like Karl-Heinz Stockhausen or John Cage, and kind of peters out the modernist movement with people like Philip Glass or Terry Riley and the minimalists. And in fact, Leonard Bernstein, in his, I believe it was 1973, Harvard lectures, said he was amazed that there were people working for 20 minutes in the key of A, almost the same note over and over. But that was a big thing to him because we were moving out of that more jagged, sharp modernist music. And the other the other possible thing that modern music means is, rock, jazz, electronic music, rap, folk music, not folk, well, yeah, some folk, country music, all other kinds of pop music. And in our time, pop is the dominant strain, more than rock. So, what is the point of making all of this music? Let me give you something that'll incorporate both definitions of modern music. And let me give you, right now, I'm going to conjure this up, an illustration, a diagram, of, here's a scheme of a triangle. And in the triangle, you'll see a few different parts. On the top of the triangle is what we might call the meaning element of music, or its artistic quality, art. On one side of the triangle, doesn't matter which, but we'll put it where we put it right now, is its place, its function. To use the older word, its decorum, where it fits decorously, not decoration, not as mere like ornament, but rather as its function as in society. So, for instance, we'll come to Bach in a moment, but a work song would be have a definite function besides being music. So its meaning would be whatever the lyrics were, but its function would be as a work song. And finally, on the other side of the triangle, it's the what we might call its communication, its ability to reach out and entertain someone. Let's discuss that word entertainment for just a bit. Entertainment, the best way to imagine entertainment is like this. There are two poles, and on one pole, you have tied something, and it goes to the other pole. So you have a line between two poles. This is literally what the word means. This thing holding between two poles. And you can see yourself like a tightrope walker in between. It keeps you up above the dirt of things. It essentially allows you to look down on life. It takes you away. But of course, you don't live there. And that is the big problem for us today. Now, let's talk about this triangle. All music, but more importantly, pretty much all art, had elements that communicated meaning, it had a function, and it had a way of communicating that allowed people to appreciate it. Now, there were different kinds of arts, different kinds of music, and some we would call folk music, and others we would call classical music, and different cultures had different kinds of classical music. But essentially, they were always together. Even Bach's music is amazing. It's the most artistic, most complex, most meaningful music you could possibly imagine. And it communicates things like his faith in God, life of suffering and redemption. Even his instrumental music, if you think of his toccata and fugue in D minor. It's just absolutely breathtaking what it's communicating, even if you can't really pinpoint it. Although he made a piece like that to function as something to focus yourself upon, maybe your sins before a church service. And Bach's music had a function. It was often used in a church for various music for various purposes, or it was commissioned to celebrate something, or it was a piece of music that you would listen to in a small room and really pay attention to, a chamber piece. Or on the other hand, it also communicated. When people walked out of a church where Bach's music was being used as the cantata, They didn't walk out scratching their head saying, what was all that crazy music about? They walked out, they might have been saying, Hans Ruckmacher says this, they might have said, that tenor was off this morning. But they wouldn't have said, I wonder what, that I didn't understand that tune at all. I didn't understand that melody. It didn't make sense to me. Wasn't shocking to them. It wasn't trying to prove a point of some sort. Well, if you contrast that to Beethoven is the first person in music to really finally say, okay, this art thing really art develops a capital A. And this art thing now, he, in his later works, particularly his last string quartets, he starts pulling the art away from function and communication. And what happens now, he doesn't immediately abandon tonality or anything like this, but he sets a goal. Now, at this point, I could spend an awful long time on this question of what happened. I'm not going to, because it's really complex. And it also duplicates itself again in jazz. Modern jazz also ends up in the same sort of place that modern music does. For instance, what eventually happens is you get to music that's whole point is to be so meaningful, but so much the self-expression of the artist that it no longer knows how to communicate to people, nor does it have a place outside of academic and musically academic spheres. For instance, many of those names I mentioned as modernist composers, Schoenberg, Stockhausen, Cage, a good many of you listening may not know their work at all. Schoenberg maybe more than, say, Boulez. But, and here's the point, that's because the music had ceased to have any connection with its ability to communicate or entertain or to have a function where you would run into this. Something else happened, though, at the same time. It wasn't just that this music left and started drifting into this realm of philosophy, really, but the whole triangle begins to fall to pieces. And so you have, on this side, the function of music becomes less and less and less. So much so to the point today that in, say, American society, we have very little music that functions in a place anymore, except maybe you could say cheerleader chants, military drill calls, cadence calls, this sort of thing. And that's pretty low on the musical scale of music. That is to say, it's just chanting. And of course, hymns, and that's a problem we're going to come to in a moment here. That is to say, what happened to music in the churches. So, then entertainment drifts off by itself. What is the thing in music or any art that communicates? Well, it's the story, it's the narrative. More importantly, it's the emotion. And but whereas, say, in great works of art or even folk works of art, the emotion is genuine. In this entertainment without meaning and increasingly without function, the emotion becomes sentimentality. And I define sentimentality the following way. It's emotion that is inappropriate for the object of that emotion. So that can be music that is inappropriate for God, because it's making God into something he is not. It can be emotion inappropriate for another person. The emotions, it can be certainly emotion that's inappropriate. And we find whole vast realms of popular culture that are these strange emotions. The best way to look at it would be to look at it, and I've said this before, I'll probably say it again, like a McDonald's hamburger. A McDonald's hamburger is food cut off from nutrition and meaning, nutrition being the function. And so that it's just the taste, and the taste is pulled aside. And what are the things that communicate taste to us? It's like, if you really want to get the taste, it's like oil, salt, fat or oil, salt, sugar, things like that. In other words, you just get this emphasis on what communicates, but it's not a great meal. In other words, it doesn't serve the meaning of food, nor does it serve all of the nutrition of food. It just does that. Now, someone interestingly the other day said to me, in some sort of, I was responding to someone's comment that Martin Scorsese said that in cinema, Marvel movies aren't really cinema. He said, and by cinema, he didn't mean they aren't films. He meant that they aren't works of art, and cinema being film as art. And he was saying that they aren't really that. They're more like theme park rides. And there's a whole discussion here about the nature of these movies, which could go along very well with a discussion about video games, since all these things are tied together now in a certain way. And I'm going to put that discussion and stick it over here because it's not a good time for it. But I said, well, yeah, the problem with these movies is that they are kind of empty. I mean, I left Avengers Endgame going, yeah, that was enjoyable, I suppose. And at this moment, I conjure up very little of the imagery. Well, I wasn't invested in it in the right way, someone would say. And someone said to me, well, I went to see Avengers Endgame and I felt something. And my response to that person was, yeah, and I go to McDonald's and I taste something. It's not that there's no emotion in these things. It's that the emotion isn't necessarily honestly won. Unlike, for instance, another movie like Joker, where, oh boy, that emotion in that movie is pretty honestly won, I would say. And I have a video on that. You can watch that anytime you want. So, where we are with entertainment. Entertainment for entertainment's sake, without any meaning, without any function, is pretty pointless. That isn't to condemn all the different kinds of music. I mean, I pay attention to music even when I find so much music now to be essentially empty. And that includes music in the church. So the point is this. It isn't bad to express yourself in music, but if that's all you've got, you haven't got enough. And Tarkovsky says it the best in his book, Sculpting in Time, when he says the artist is a servant, perpetually paying for the gift that's been given to him. So the point is, it's not that, you don't do it for yourself. You do it to give something to others. So music can lead to something else. There is good music today. It is just not heard on the radios or televisions anymore. It's buried away. We often find ourselves going back into the past, which will be an important talking point to a question in a moment. Let us continue. Daniel Brew asks me the following. He says, "Hi, Bern. What are your thoughts on the use of instrument-based music and amplified sound as technique for creating emotional encounters with the Holy Spirit in its modern popular form? How might this developing trend map onto the narrative laid out in your How We Got Here and Noise Enters Music series?" And then he's got a separate question, which I'm going to treat very shortly because it relates to a much bigger line of discussion. Would you agree that some sort of very important shift happened to music culture and American Christianity as African American spirituals and field hollers were slowly transformed into folk, blues, jazz, and eventually rock? And the answer to the second one is yes, and not negatively. That is to say that those were actually, that along with the music of poor white Americans, which we call country music, are actually all, I look at them as all one form. The white European-based music and the black African-based music so often in America are united and passed around. I'm not going to go into this. I could go into talking about minstrel music, which I find absolutely amazing, from which was the white reflection of black American music. And And it's also kind of taboo to talk about too much. I did a whole lecture of that, and that is going to be something which is going to show up behind my paywall at some point, just because I don't feel like dealing with, whatever anyone's going to accuse me of by talking about that stuff. But the truth is, without understanding that, you don't understand American music. So at the moment, I'm going to put it behind the paywall. I may get it out from jail eventually, seeing how things move in our culture, whether there's more open discussion or not. But the point is this. Actually, it was a very good change, and it kept America from falling into the European trap of sentimentality. It also helped America to develop sentimentality. A long story. We'll leave it there. So let's go back to this whole thing. Instrument-based music. By that, I'm assuming you're meaning a band plugged in, playing as part of the praise team, the worship team, at some sort of church that, has this stuff. First of all, there are two things involved. Well, you're saying music that is instrument-based. You don't mean the usual organ or piano or even guitar. You mean when these things are turned into kind of an entertaining structure. And the other problem is amplified sound. And this is something that people really don't understand in churches. The more you amplify, the more problems you've got. And but people often will say, but there are people who need to hear. Well, first of all, if I've been in places where, a folk singer is playing in a room about the size of the room I'm in now with amplification, and I'm sitting there saying, is there some problem where you can't sing to fill a room that's this small? People have way over. Amplification can kill music, and it can also turn music into something it really shouldn't be. Very manipulative. Now, there's a lot to be said about that, and I'm not going to go too far into it. But here's the problem. Instrument-based music. Okay, your standard band format. I remember back in the early days of the Jesus People, we would talk for quite a bit about whether rock music could be played in church or whether Christians should listen to rock music. I didn't have too much problems with it because before I became a Christian, I was listening to music and I knew the difference between good music and bad music. And obviously there were some sorts of things you really shouldn't bring into the church and other things that you could. And so we talked about it. Now, eventually what happened was that music came into churches. But the one thing we never talked about was whether commercial music could be played by Christians. I think the answer to rock music is a very nuanced, it really depends. The answer to whether they should play any sort of commercial music is absolutely not, ever. Why do I take such a hard stand on that? Because it turns Christianity into sentimentality. And by turning Christianity into sentimentality, you have essentially destroyed it. Also, that music can only be one thing. It can only be a kind of propaganda. And when this started was the sentimentality and commercial music coming into the churches was actually at the end of the 19th century. And it was at that point that you really find essentially the invasion of a very commercialized form of the romantic philosophy. The same one that's pulling the triangle apart is now entering the church in these, it's amazing how many songs from the late 19th century, early 20th century essentially could be played on a circus calliope. That is to say, or they could be done later with a really smooth, easy listening band. And then eventually, by the time you get to the 1980s, you get music that is just way overproduced. And eventually people start singing this music. I mean, when I hear the kinds of songs that, say, Hillsong does, the Hillsong churches, and they're really repetitive praise songs and really it's just like a gooey sentimentality of people going, I believe, over and over and over, to which I'm going like, if you have to sing it that much, you really don't believe it. That is where the problem is. The problem isn't in, black rhythms. Anyone who thinks that, you've got a little bit of a racist streak and you need to think about. But people who say it's not the rhythms, it's not rock rhythms, it's not that sort of thing. I mean, like I said, there can be problems with that sort of thing. Don't get me wrong. I'm certainly not advocating anything like heavy metal in the church, although good heavy metal is pretty good in its place. But no, it's the commercial thing. It's music as pure entertainment without any real meaning to it. That's the problem. That's the issue. And if we don't deal with that, it doesn't matter. That's one of the reasons why so many churches in Protestant America essentially are killing themselves. So what they're doing is they're anesthetizing themselves. They are essentially injecting a kind of embalming fluid into the corpse to keep it looking alive. But it ain't alive. It's dying. And but that's why I think these questions are good at helping us get beyond that. Okay, let's go to the next question. Rick Penner couldn't really, I guess he probably may not have a YouTube channel, so he didn't leave his message on in the comment section. So he found me on the Facebook Anadromous Life page and left a 930-word shall we call it extended email. I'm not going to go into everything he wrote, which was interesting, but we'll continue with the music theme. And he had a kind of a long question about that. But let me. I've selected, we'll say 100 words from his email, and we'll do that. He says. Musically, he was very, he says he's 72 years old, so that means he's about 8 years older than I am, which means he was in prime territory for understanding the music of the 1960s. And as he says, I followed everything through punk and new wave until rap and hip hop came along. Then I lost interest. If there's no melody or harmony, and even the rhythm is crude and simplistic, then why listen? It baffles me. If one wants to emphasize rhythms that are complex and interesting, try Cuban salsa or African polyrhythmic music. But rap? My main question, what is the meaning behind rap and hip-hop? More importantly, why has our pop culture, abandoned traditional music so completely? Yes, there are antecedents of rap in older music. He mentions Bob Dylan with Subterranean Homesick Blues, Chuck Berry's Too Much Monkey Business, and in fact, there are quite a few others. One can think of songs like Convoy by C.W. McCall, a lot of country kind of rapping things. Lauren Green, who used to star in the TV show Bonanza, used to specialize in those kind of songs. But rap music itself is something very different. He goes on, what musical values does rap promote? And if the point is to eliminate musical values completely, what happens to our souls when the music goes away? The sounds then become alien, cartoonish, and inert. These are sound effects, not music, experimental sound sculptures at best. If you follow local and particular pop music of various countries around the world on YouTube, African High Life, for example, or Fijian Sigi Drigi, which is something new to me. Sigi Drigi, which is something new to me, and I'm going to have to look into that. You find the forms began percolating early on and reached their peak around the same time as American pop music did, 1960s through 1980s. Then decline sets in, and regions start to copy American rap and hip-hop forms. It all sounds the same now, whether you're listening from Greece or Israel or Japan or Ecuador, etc. My theory, most young people listen to pop music because it's kind of wallpaper or decoration to their life, not because they appreciate good music. Rap and hip-hop offer a raging mouth that's always telling off anyone they don't like, or a science fictionist soundscape of improbable babble, interesting at times but not moving. Still, the rock music of the 1950s and the sophisticated popular styles of the 1960s were so far ahead of today's pop music that it makes one wonder. If the tendency in pop music is for commercialism and youth wallpaper to dominate, what went on in the 60s and around that time that allowed such good music to be produced? And then why was the music scene so quickly destroyed? And all I can say is, okay, we got massive stuff going on here, and I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time on it, but I will promise you this. Eventually I will get here, because I can answer this question, and it will probably take me about 13 hours or more. So, okay, first of all, what is rap music? Well, obviously rap music is the talking over rhythms with some musical accompaniment. And there is a kind of a thing that happens, and I've noticed this happening particularly among people my age and older, and sometimes a bit even younger than me, that rap is short for, crap. And it's the idea that rap music is there's just not much going on. It's not music. There's not a lot of melody and such. I would say this, I was actually in New York City. I arrived my first time in New York City. I got off the plane in 1979, and the Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight was playing endlessly everywhere. It was the first huge rap hit. And I immediately said, the RCA Victor dog, his master's voice, listening, immediately said, "What is that? That is different." I thought it was very interesting. It was obviously based on funk rhythms, but with someone talking over in this kind of like, I wouldn't want to call it sing-song, but there was a certain kind of a vocal styling to it. I moved to New York City within a year after that, and ended up spending quite a bit of time in the music world at that time, and certainly have my share of early rap 12-inch singles. If you know what I'm talking about, the 12-inch single was the thing to listen to in rap music. So, I spent time with Curtis Blow music or the Sugar Hill Gang or Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five and all of this stuff. Up until Run DMC is kind of like there's a whole period right in there. Run DMC is kind of like the dividing line to the next group, which includes the Beastie Boys, and then it gets really commercialized, and you have people like MC Hammer and Vanilla Ice. And then a lot of changes happen in the early 90s, where you have gangster rap, and you have kind of jazzy rap and other stuff happening. And then something happens where at the second half of the 90s, there's a lot of, someone's going to argue with me and saying there's been a lot of music, but the gangster rap thing kind of takes over and becomes this thing which travels around the world. Rap was beginning to travel around the world earlier, but suddenly this idea of, it's almost like, and there was a good element to it. I think the first song that really had a message was called The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. And, rats in the front room, roaches in the back, junkies in the alley with a baseball bat. Oh, that was also one of those songs you couldn't get away from in New York City. It was everywhere, and it became a huge hit across the country. And it also dealt with social issues. And out of that eventually came what Ice-T called the crime rhyme. And I like some of the early Ice-T stuff. But eventually all of this kind of, up through people like the early works of Cypress Hill and such. But at that point, you see the shift where we're not just discussing the problems. We are celebrating this kind of culture of deterioration. Now, in fact, one of the most important things to understand, both about punk and rap music, was that they were both musics that came from what can I say? They were musics that came from, shall we say, philosophically and culturally reduced backgrounds. And that is to say, these are there was a sense that the 60s was like an earthquake that cracked open. And both punk and rap are musics on the other side of the earthquake. And they are musics that represent a kind of life in a decayed zone, life in a entropically diminished zone. So punk, whether it was punk's DIY qualities, which I love, or its aggressive nature, which is much more problematic, or whether it was rap's DIY nature, which I also love. And in fact, one of the things that you have to remember about rap music, it was made by people who were essentially too poor to afford musical instruments. And so what they did was they started making music off of often stolen turntables and such, playing the certain cuts on the wheels of steel, certain cuts over and over and over again of pieces, and then talking over them. The concept came from Jamaican toasting. Now, as a concept, it actually turns out to have a lot of different variations. And here's the interesting thing about the talking in rap music. One of the things we don't think about much, and this is, I think, especially true in America, is that language, words, and music used to be a lot closer to each other than they are now. So that, you can still hear this when you go to a Black American church and you hear the preacher talking and the rhythms and such. You can also hear this when you go to a poor white Appalachian church in some places, and you'll hear the rhythms. And that rhythm is partly speaking, partly musical.
I want you to have somewhere to go. Now, I got some brothers, but I can't leave you with my brother. Your other sons, because they don't believe in me.
The thing about it is, we're coming now to another point. I'm going to take what little time I'm going to take it. I'm going to take it without worrying about it. There comes a time in my life, I think you have to make a choice about what kind of a church you're going to be a part of. I don't know whether you agree with that or not. Sometimes folks say, well, you're either Ragnar Baptist or nothing. Whether you go 400 or 500 miles away and hear a lot of directions, they don't even know what you're talking about. When you say Ragnar Baptist, you go across the oceans, they think you some kind of foreign religion that they didn't know a thing in the world about. And they don't. As far as knowing you by that name. And I've said this before. I went into World War II, and at the induction station, that little lady behind the desk said, "What religion are you?" I said, "Oh, Ragnar Baptist." She said, "We don't have that kind."
And the further you go back in time, the more this characteristic shows up. So that if you were, one of the things that would strike you, if you were to go to, even right now, if you go to a very primitive church on, say, the Isle of Skye in Scotland, and you go into one of these places where they're still speaking Gaelic, there are very few of them left, but you hear the way they're talking, it's rhythmic. It's a different sort of rhythmic. And every culture, every language, poetry, music, language were all much closer together. You couldn't have imagined Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad and the Odyssey as being simply talked to like, I'm ordering lunch. It's like, yes, and Ulysses then did this, and you couldn't imagine that. It had to be poetic utterances. Russia and Georgia, where I am today, I find that speech has a much more percolating rhythmic quality. And when Russians do poetry, it is not the same as poetry being, Russians declaim poetry. They do it. I find it interesting that, in Georgia, I saw a play the other night, and the play was not done in a realistic manner at all. And by that, I don't mean it was Shakespeare's The Tempest. Now, I didn't understand all the Georgian words, but I understand Shakespeare's Tempest. And it was interesting, when they talked, they didn't do what you often see in American theater, where one person talks, another person will talk, another person will talk. It was rather one person would talk, and there would be a space. and maybe the person would walk over to the person. Then there'd be the next line, and it was just this almost unusual rhythm to the language. So language and rhythm has always been there, and I think that's what rap kind of hit, and it hit that in a way. So, for instance, many people never made any poetry prior to using this rap technique. However, you are absolutely right. Rap music has colonized the world, but so has punk rock, heavy metal, and worst of all, pop music. And it is for the same reason that what rap can do. Well, one thing rap does is it gives the illusion of challenging the authorities. And I would say it's pretty much an illusion, because most of the greatest rap music, and particularly from the 90s on, has all been on the largest labels. They're not challenging anybody, and the people behind the scenes are making lots of money off of people who think they're challenging the system. They're not challenging the system. But that's the image that goes across around the world, that the rap music is the music of poor people challenging the system. It's the music of the people of different races challenging the system. It's the music of people, but there's also the effect of it's white kids pretending to be cool and pretending to be dangerous, or maybe in some cases becoming dangerous. With it goes the almost globalization of the same kinds of graffiti you see in the South Bronx in the late 70s and early 80s. And in fact, let me show you an illustration of that right now from Georgia. Georgia has absolutely nothing to do with South Bronx in the 1980s. And yet, of course, there is rap music here. And here is some graffiti. And this is the bad stuff. There's really great street art here. Let me show you some of the street art. And that I tend to look at as much more favorably, because it's often in places that need some art. But the tagging and the blocky Von Baudet style block letters, which there's a whole, if you know about comic book art and everything, you'll know what I'm referring to. I mean, it's the style that was developed in the South Bronx in the late 70s. I find that extraordinarily annoying that it's gone all over the world, but we find pop culture, entertainment culture, like I said a few minutes ago, entertainment culture is global. And it's also, you could say that rap music is dark sentimentality. So we'll leave that there. Let's see, what else? Yeah, youth wallpaper, absolutely. But the point is this, for most people today, you see them sitting in subway cars or driving around. Music has become wallpaper. It's not just youth wallpaper, it's wallpaper. It has become this thing. It is simply our soundtrack. And it, if you're walking down the street listening to, rap music and such, and you're sitting there going like, yeah. Now, I'm not saying there's not great rap music, nor that there's not great rap music now. There is, but it's certainly in the minority. There's an awful lot of rap music which just repeats the fetishization of things like guns and booty and money and things like that. But there's also that it's a way of pretending to be cool, and we're going to leave that where it is right now. Interestingly enough, some of the better rap music in the 21st century has been accompanied with singing. So, because of the inherent limitations. So we're going to leave music for now. Thank you, Rick, for that question. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of it. Like I say, the real answer to these questions is I've spent my life on it, and we're going to leave that there for now. I've also spent my life thinking about film. Thank you, Laura Giles, is it Giles or Giles? I'm going to say Giles. She asks, I love the movies of Powell and Pressburger, as does Scorsese. Got any past interest or thoughts about their movies? And she's also got another question, which I'll save. And the answer is the movies of Powell and Pressburger are absolutely amazing. They are, in some sense, fatalistic, almost all of them. Red Shoes, The Red Shoes is probably the most famous one. And it's about ballet and the conflict between art and commerce, art and life, actually. Then there is his Black Narcissus, about Catholic monks in the Himalayas. You've got, what is it? It has two different names. Stairway to Heaven is one of the names with, again, he deals a lot with concepts of fate and art. And it's not his final film, but it is the one that kind of lost him his prestige. Peeping Tom, which came out a little bit, I believe, slightly before Psycho, was also just as shocking as Psycho, but more unnerving because, like Alfred Hitchcock, Michael Powell, who was really the creative genius here, Pressburger was more on the production side. Powell was the, whereas you talk about the Hitchcock blonde, Michael Powell had the redhead. But in Peeping Tom, he does, Hitchcock killed off his blonde in Psycho. And in Peeping Tom, the murderer really sadistically kills over and over his redhead. And that makes you think about the nature of their movies. But they are so interesting to watch. And Michael Powell is definitely an artist. He's not simply a commercial filmmaker. And I highly recommend, especially The Red Shoes. If you want to start with one Michael Powell film that'll get you hooked, it's the movie about ballet. It's the movie that if a girl is like 7, 8, 9 years old and watches The Red Shoes, she's going to want to do ballet. It's that simple. And it's also a fascinating film. But if you graduate, you can move on to Peeping Tom, and you probably won't be thanking me later. Brandon Meal asks about visual art. He says, I was hoping you could speak about visual art. I'd like to hear your comments on contemporary art, painting, and if possible, a field of study I am pursuing in the visual art realm, concept art for the entertainment industry. What do you think the visual artist's role is in society and theologically? Or maybe if you have anything to say about discerning God's calling and making your passion your vocation. As far as God's calling, the artist is a servant, Tarkovsky. This is a little too theological for me today. Maybe some other day I would deal with that. It's too big a question. We're going to put it over here and just refer you back to, remember, the artist is always a servant, Tarkovsky, Sculpting in Time. Let's go back, and finally in the end he says, let's dig. That is my biggest message always. Dig into things, do not be afraid. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on contemporary art. Okay. Contemporary art in the 21st century. Oh my goodness. I don't even know where to begin on that. I mean, I do. I don't have a lot of good thoughts to say about it. Concept art for the entertainment industry. I know what conceptual art is, but concept art for the entertainment industry. I get it. For a minute there, I thought you were talking about conceptual art, but what you're really talking about is the pre-visualization kind of stuff. Coming up with drawings for, what is our villain going to look like? What is the creature going to look like? That sort of thing, which is interesting because at least at that point, see, one of the problems I have with contemporary art is that it is so ironic. I worked in the art world in New York City for about 3 years because I, among other things, I occasionally do some sort of visual arts myself. Here, let me demonstrate. Here is a painting I did of some sort of decayed landscape, and here's one of a woman's face. We'll put those up there for now. And you can look at those. So yes, I do think about art. I did not go to art school, but I have a pretty strong relationship to art. I mean, while I'm here, I was just looking at a book of Georgian metal bas-relief work from the Orthodox tradition going back 1,000 years or more. I'm always interested in the arts and the visual arts. And nowadays I tend to put more of my visual ideas into videos. And in fact, I have a hidden YouTube channel, which I haven't told anyone about and has gotten very few views because I'm kind of slowly constructing it so that when someone does find it, they'll go like, what is going on with these videos? But that's where I put my visual work. Let's see, I can hear your thoughts on contemporary art, painting, and okay. A lot of the art story is similar to the music story. That is, the unities that held the work together in the triangle of meaning and function, place, and communication have been destroyed. So that if you're doing a work for the entertainment industry, you can pretty much say that's over here in the entertainment zone. And because it has a place, it also has a function. Does it have that much meaning? I think Tarkovsky would probably say no. So that, for instance, when I think about all the sketches and artwork I've seen for, say, Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or the Alien movies, although Alien is a very different story because of the work of H.R. Giger. But, so much of this conceptual work for pre-visualization in movies, it's interesting. It certainly communicates. It certainly has a place. That is to say, it serves a film. But the bigger question is, what does it have to say as far as meaning goes? And that's where it gets really weak. It's like it's got a bit of function. It's not, that function isn't as big a function as, say, work music would have, or painting in a church would have. But nevertheless, it's primarily occupying this entertainment zone. And there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, according to what I understand about the art world, what you're doing is purely illustration. That is to say, it would be illustration. It would not be considered capital A art. But then again, I'm not in favor of capital A art. Capital A art is the thing that's become so ironic. And so I would call it pretentious if it pretended to do anything. Instead, it tears things apart. It knows that pretension is bad, but it has no answer for the question. I once walked into a gallery show in New York when I was working in the art world, and I worked as an art mover. I purposely got this job in order to see if what I was doing was at all considered artistic. And the answer I got was no. Even though, as someone said, well, there's too much emotion in it. And believe me, it wasn't simply sentimental emotion. But evidently, emotion, well, that communicates. Communication doesn't go with the real world of contemporary art. So I walked into a show once. It was at the Mary Boone Gallery, and I looked around, and I said, these look like somebody's finger paintings. And the whole point was, and this is where you're in the cult of modern art, it was all someone pretending to do bad abstraction. Okay, it was like someone in the 1950s or who had looked at, say, Jackson Pollock, or looked at some sort of, like de Kooning or this abstract expressionist art, and then said, I could do that, and then they do it, and it looks bad. And that's what the art was. Do you get the layers of irony there? If you do, you understand where the art world is, and it's kind of stuck there. There is an awful lot more I could say about art, but all I can say is, concept art for the entertainment industry isn't a bad thing. It isn't about self-expression too much. Not that, like I said, self-expression isn't the key. But the question is, what does it do on the meaning scale? And I would say that you'd have to probably have a side kind of art if you wanted to communicate. The problem is today, it's like it's art, capital A, modernist, postmodern art, or it's illustration of some sort, or at the worst level, you find art for function in crafts fairs and stuff, where it's all just like this cheesy stuff that people will buy just to hang on their wall or to fill a spot in the room or something. And actually, let me show you a painting I found here in Georgia. I found this. I spent 200 lari on it, which is about... No, I didn't spend 200 lari. I talked them down from 200 lari to 100 lari. So this was about $35. And check this out. What is going on here in this this crucifix? And so you see it. And first of all, do you notice the character behind the crucifix? This big dark face. You see two eyes there. It's like got a dark hood on or something, almost like the executioner. And then, are those people like dressed in towels? Or it's a very unusual. It's a work of art. But I find this work of art interesting because it was someone, I think, in the Soviet era, trying to understand the meaning of the crucifixion. And does that character in the back symbolize the devil, or is it the state? And it's to me, that's a work that's very high in meaning. It serves a function in the fact that it's a crucifix, and it serves, at least it calls into mind an icon of some sort. But it also has this strange, what is it communicating? What is the meaning? But it sparks those things. I find real art like that interesting. I'm not saying that's a great work of art at all, but I do find it worth contemplating. Whereas I don't find, say, the artwork for, E.T. or Indiana Jones or, Marvel movies to be anything that you can contemplate and wonder about. So we'll stop there on the art question. And believe me, that's just at some point I will deal more with arts. Okay, we're getting somewhere. We're out of the world. Now let's talk about just some 21st century issues. Sandeman 21 says, you briefly brought up the topic of quote-unquote creepy and the superficial way it's used. I believe it was related to people reacting to old Halloween costumes. Going more into that topic, what do modern people deem creepy, and why might it be worthwhile? And I'm assuming the creepy stuff. Why might the creepy stuff be worthwhile? That's what I'm assuming. Either that or why is modern people deeming things creepy worthwhile? I'm going to go with the why are the things themselves perhaps worthwhile. And let me pull you up a couple of images here. First of all, this is considered creepy. It's like, again, old Halloween costumes. And this is not bloody, gory, monstrous. Why? Why is the monstrous thing not considered creepy? Well, for one thing, the creepy thing has this aspect of amateurism related to it. It has, then we're looking at it through an old black and white photograph. More importantly, we are looking at it, it is not at all related to the entertainment industry, whereas the horrific thing we are looking at isn't creepy because we can understand it as a product of the modern motion picture industry, and it's kind of scary, I suppose, if you react to that sort of thing. But these days, people will watch endless quantities of blood and guts on something like The Walking Dead and not even think about it. It's not creepy to them. Sometimes, occasionally, that almost gets creepy. But I think it's interesting that creepy has become this category where it's like people look at something that's kind of like off, homemade, handmade from the past. It's not part of the commercial vision of the day. Even when the commercial vision of the day is horrific. Now, there are movies that set out to be creepy. I can think of a lot of the movies from the Blumhouse studios. The Conjuring, some found footage films. People will call those kind of creepy. Found footage films more than other things, because the found footage, it imitates, it simulates actual found footage films. It simulates actual old photography. Now, what's interesting is there's a side note here. Creepy used to mean bugs, snakes. They creeped and they crawled. Worms are creepy. You see, like what did creepy used to be? You'd open a coffin on a body that was half decomposing, and there'd be worms and bugs crawling out. Now that's creepy. That's really creepy, the way the word is meant to be, because it involves the things that creep and crawl around. Interestingly, we don't call things crawly. But creepy, yeah. But then there is somehow the word, by the 1960s, I remember the Manson family. Well, I don't remember them personally, but they used to talk about their midnight creeps, where they would go out and they would, kind of peep into people's houses and stuff. And this is especially creepy when you think about what they did to the bodies later. So, but they called it their creepy crawlies. But yeah, so creepy was really dark. But somehow creepy became old. And what's also interesting is certain young teenage and 20-something girls, if they're approached by an older man, will call him instantly creepy. And this is, sometimes just talking to an older man, and specifically an older man, would be creepy. Now, I suppose you could have an older woman, if you went over to some woman who lived in an apartment in New York City that was, she'd been living there, and she has everything's kind of fallen apart, and you went in there and there was like cigarette smoke hanging in the air and nicotine stains on the ceilings because of that. I suppose that would be creepy according to the new definition as well. And so what it is creepy ends up being somehow related to age. Somehow age became the determining thing. Age and amateurism. And I find that interesting. Now, as someone who works with puppets, I find creepy great. Maybe it's the fact I'm older. Am I creepy? I find creepy to be a wonderful thing to achieve in puppetry. You want the homemade, handmade quality to come out. I guess we're still talking about art. Let's go on to the next one. Why is El Ronin Nato? That's kind of like what, Japanese Mexican? Why is cute a problem? Or the modern concept of cuteness that for some reason, like fun, has been separated from its original meaning. From what I discovered, the word cute comes from the word acute, which means sharp or cunning. What is actually kind of surprising, that if we compare that with what today cute means, right? So cute today doesn't mean sharp or stunning. It means big eyes, little mouth. Oh, okay. Cute. Oh, cute's a huge problem. I could spend an entire video on cute. I could spend probably about 5 videos on cute. It's become a serious problem for our culture. I have dealt with cute in the Anadromous Life essay site. I have a few essays on cute in a section called Sacred Cows of the Culture. And I'll put a link to that below. And in there, I get into it a lot more in depth, and also the history of cute than I will now. All I can say is this. And, well, interestingly, this goes back to the modern art problem. After modern art has completely shattered the image and stripped away all of the meaning that came out of the Renaissance from culture, then pushing the concept of entertainment So you suddenly have just entertainment stuff. I mean, you look at any Hallmark card, it's only entertainment visuals. When you go to something like, this week, Frozen 2 is the huge movie at the theaters. Well, that is purely entertainment. It has nothing to do with a place and nothing to do with meaning. It has only to do with entertainment and propaganda. The ideas smuggled in cute. That's the interesting thing about cute. Cute is a great vehicle for smuggling ideas in that you want to propagandize people with, because they're put off by you're not criticizing the big-eyed creatures, are you? No, cute is a problem. Cute is a kind of a sickness that we'll say developed as a result of the same commercialization of the romantic ideas that invaded the church with their schmaltzy songs in the late 19th century. You don't know what cute actually means today, and there will be people who will talk scientifically about cute. It's the certain ratio of the eyes, the smallness of the eyes, and that little mammals have this. Little cats, of course, and dogs, and almost any baby thing is cute. Puppy, any sort of fledgling animal can be considered cute. And then, of course, little baby humans. Oh, my goodness. And how can you say anything against cute, Brian? Well, that's exactly the point. You can't. And it's become an invasive concept. And I think what's interesting, it's replacing the concept of art. Think about that for a minute. Art was destroyed. What's taking its place? Weird scrawlings of big-eyed creatures. These didn't exist before the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, there's a bit of a prehistory. I go into it in my essay. But cute is a serious problem. That's all I'm going to tell you. Go find my essay, and I elaborate it more there. I am tempted right now to spend much too long talking about it. Kind of a history question. Mark Spector. Rick Penner gets the award for the longest question, and Mark Spector gets the award, and I'll tell you what for after I read the question. He says, how have guilt, shame, violence been across time and cultures, and its relevance in today's age? Mark Spector gets the award for saying the least and having the most difficult question that I cannot possibly tackle with any degree of satisfaction. This is huge, Mark. This is huge. And I will say a couple of words, and I won't satisfy anything, and let me just try to make it as brief as possible. There are cultures of guilt and cultures of honor or shame. Put it that way. Cultures of guilt, cultures of shame is how it's usually discussed in anthropological circles. The West has traditionally been a culture of guilt, which means if you do something wrong, you have to be found guilty. Not that everyone was always found guilty, because shame still operates, but it is the guilt that is important. So you are put away in prison for precisely 5 years or less if we choose to forgive you. That's guilt. Guilt implies also forgiveness. But shame, its opposite is honor. Now, some people I've heard, and I've found it interesting that I've run across YouTube videos of people trying to get away from the politically correct culture who say things like, we need to revive the culture of honor. Well, they don't know what they're talking about. The culture of honor, well, yeah, honor is important. But honor only without the guilt part? No. Because what you find on the left is people, how do we want to communicate a change in, say, sexual ethics or a change in gender ethics? The best way to do that is to shame you. If you see someone in the media, like these really smartly dressed people in a television studio, and something will happen, like when the whole transgender bathroom issue became a huge issue, there wasn't a discussion of when we all agreed about this topic. It was simply already you were ashamed if you didn't go along with it. What a great way to silence any questioning, simply to shame you. You see this in Asian cultures where losing face is a terrible thing to do. Losing face, in other words, being shamed. That's a terrible thing to have happen. And my feeling is that I would much rather live in a culture where you actually have guilt. And the shaming aspect is much more lessened. Violence, there have been violence everywhere across cultures. These things are very important today. I think I'll leave it right there. And all I could say is I could spend hours on this, and I think other people probably have. But it is an important thing, and I'm just not qualified to. I suppose I could talk about it, but I just don't have the time that question really requires, and I'm not sure I'm going to get to it in the standard role of things. You never know, though. It's just not something I've focused on that strongly. Okay, technology and media questions. All right, so he had one name. He decided, Freddie from Kenya, how's that? Decided he actually gave me a name that I'm glad he did, because I wouldn't want to really pronounce his moniker. My question is on Elo. I've been interested in him lately and watched several videos on him. One interesting thing was how he saw science as an outgrowth and not the cause of techne. Techne is in the Greek word from which we get the word technique and eventually technology. Or maybe I'm wrong. What caused this rise in techne? Is it a stance we took towards nature? And did he see a way out of it? Freddie from Kenya. All right. Well, first of all, I think there's an awful lot to say here. And I've covered some of this in my 21st Century Propaganda series on the Anadromous Life channel. There's at least 10 essays on the subject that relating to propaganda, which also relates to technology. But let me remind you of what Jacques Ellul said about, he talks about the three environments, that originally human beings were in the natural environment. And in the natural environment, of course, we got all the good things from nature. We got the sunshine, which helps so much with plant life. We have water, and we have animals to hunt and eat. We have wood to use to build things. On and on. Nature also has many, many, many bad things, and among them are the sun doesn't just help, it also can hurt, create deserts, destroy your skin. Animals aren't just for food, they can also kill you. You have infectious diseases, you have storms and bad weather. So, he says we created the next environment, which is the social environment. In the social environment, we have what is it? In the social environment, we have we banded together primarily in cities to protect ourselves. So we're protected more from the weather. We're protected more from the sun. We're protected more from animals. We're protected more, diseases actually becomes more of an issue eventually because of the clustering of people. And so what you see is that the social environment, while strengthening the human population, also starts doing strange things to the human population. So, like I say, infectious diseases get more infectious. You have all the problems, say, related to things like love. Those are primarily social problems more than they are tribal problems. In tribal situations, everyone knows how we do how people get together within that tribe. But in the social world, you have all the heartaches and miseries, the letters written, the people saying, no, you can't marry this person, the people who, too many people all wanting the same person and such. But the worst problem of all from the social realm, war. War becomes a terrible thing. And, so you have sieges and such. And how do we solve the problems of the social realm? Well, from the beginning, the answer, for instance, to war is to create more technology. And so eventually, more and more, the technology was called to solve the problems of the social realm. And so the social realm isolated us more from nature. And the technological realm that we've thus made isolates us not only from nature, but the social environment as well. Consider how love is now done through the internet. Consider how, that you'll see people sitting together in a restaurant, kind of mindlessly looking at they're communicating with someone while someone's sitting right next to them. Who needs society when you have technology? So whether it's the car, the television, the plane, our vast systems of organization, all of these are techniques. And so the techniques come, and he would say this as it's a human way of finding redemption. The problem is that we have no answer to technology other than creating more technology. And each technology brings with it, the car brings the car accident. The train brings the train accident. The internet brings stalking and prying and catfishing and all this other bizarre stuff. And we're just now figuring out what the problems are. How, like people were talking about the internet would bring us all this freedom. And the truth is, oh no, it doesn't. It brings a kind of slavery. But the thing Elul says, and that's really important, is that it doesn't do everything. It always leaves cracks. And he called these cracks of freedom. And in the last chapter of his last book on technology, The Technological Bluff, in the last few pages, he talks about being free as a human being and how we can manage to do it. And essentially, there are cracks of freedom at any given time. Right now, YouTube is a crack of freedom. I can talk and say freely, and you can find me. We can communicate. But will this last very long? No. And if this freedom does not lead to real, genuine social interaction and real concern for the world of nature, then what does it mean? If it's one more abstraction, then what does it mean? Which then leads us directly into Samantha Blythe's question. I would like to know what daily routines, rhythms, and habits you put in place, my intentionality to help yourself live the more human kind of life you talk about. Well, I'm not going to go into all my daily routines. I'm not going to talk about any spiritual patterns. But I am going to say this. This is my cell phone. I do not have the real thing. All this does is it gets me messages and I can talk to people. It does not connect me to the internet. I have a dumb phone. That's on purpose because I've been sitting watching people with their smartphones becoming stupider. So I limit my use. When I lived in Alaska, because people don't know much about Alaska and they have no idea how people actually would live in a small town in Alaska, I just had a landline. And I only have this because I was traveling, so, here it is. And people seem to think it's important to find me wherever I am. I have no idea why. It doesn't actually mean anything. The only message I could possibly get from here immediately would be that a good relative has died since my mother is dead and I have no other relatives that I think are trying to find me. It doesn't matter. Any message I can get, I can wait till I get home. That was my idea in Alaska, too. So that's one thing. Limit technology. I am not an early adopter of any technology. I am a late adopter. I watch and see how can this be used in a human way. Other things. I do go, like, when I live up the hill from me. Well, it's not a hill, it's a mountain. It rises to about 2,000 feet. Well, a little under 2,000 feet. I'm about 1,500 feet from here, so sometimes I go hiking up the mountain. I did that a couple mornings ago. And I leave this behind because why do you want to know about this? Why do you want to find me? I'm going hiking. Yes, but Bern, what if you trip and fall? Well, what did people do for thousands of years? When I lived in Europe the first time in 1978, 79, I think I called home twice in a year. That was fine. And I think people have become like insects in their ability to like touch feelers all the time. And I don't think it's a good development. Art. On the wall, I don't put anything. Back in Alaska, in the rooms where people would come most, except for the bathroom, I would put only works that are unrepeatable. An object I found or a painting. That's it. Because I think that images really affect people. So what I don't do is don't put like a poster that anybody else could have. I would always buy hardback books if I could. You always can't find them, but I would buy used hardback books. I would find cheap ones online. Then I would take off the shiny graphic cover because those to me are completely annoying. I like the texture of the cloth, and there's a certain kind of hardback book today that's coming out now where it's like they've pasted, or the actual hardback is the same as a paperback. It's just got a hard back on it because it's just all graphics, and the graphics I find not interesting because it's just too hard and angular. And I don't like shiny white things around the house. I think all that stuff matters. Now, I go into that in talking about in my texture lecture and in my mediated, unmediated lecture. But generally, every day I have to leave the house and I go down the hill. And when I walk back, I'm getting a lot of exercise. I will take walks and go places. Like today, I'm planning, when I'm done with this, to go out into the big world and go shopping. This isn't a question of me hopping into a car. This is a question of me getting my day pack on, and I'm going to walk. Then I'm going to take a bus for about a half hour. I'm purposely going to a certain store up the road. Then I'm going to go shopping, and then I'm probably going to walk back. And this is going to take me about an hour and a half. And on the way, I'm also looking for things. So, the idea of driving somewhere for a loaf of bread, it's just like, no, I'm not doing that. It just strikes me as a waste of life. What else do I do to try to lean against the tide of mediation? Well, a lot of this I've covered in my mediated, unmediated book. One thing I can tell you honestly is that since arriving here in Georgia, there's a lot of things that all of my stuff, my objects, my material matter is back in Alaska. And there's about 10,000 pounds, 5,000 kilos of stuff back in Alaska. I want that stuff here because the books, the music and everything, it was all part of how I lived my daily life. And I don't have that here. So, and also one of the things is I've started doing this YouTube channel here, which sucks an awful lot of time. I have managed to fill that time with other things, including watching films while I'm waiting for endless renderings. As you'll notice, I don't just simply record myself talking and leave it at that. I tend to want to produce things to the best of my ability. I'm hoping down the road in a year or so, I won't have to spend so much time on this because I won't have to make so many videos. But right now, I want to create enough of a presence where that when people find my channel, they're not just going to say, "Oh, there's a nice video." They're going to say, "Oh, there's a whole, videos on whole subject matters," and that to me is important. So while it's important, I find myself spending far too much time looking at this thing and far too much time on this thing here. What is this? Yeah, well, it's It's my old MacBook Pro. I have the old MacBook Pro that still has the CD DVD slot. And this is what I mean about thinking about things, because those things are still important to me. I am not, while I am kind of forced to, I don't stream things. I don't like that. I've done that a little bit. I don't like streaming music. I don't like streaming movies. If I'm going to get something offline, I'm going to download it. And in fact, I got really upset with Amazon the first time I purchased a video, because it was mine as long as it was on their site. But I couldn't download it. And to me, it's like, well, then it's not really mine. I didn't purchase it. This was just like some weird, elaborate rental lease agreement. So for me, I like going out. Like, for instance, the other day I went out and looked for books. The fact that I could find, endless books to read on Kindle. I mean, again, there's no... It's finding the thing. The other day I went and found some very fascinating books at a local store. Now, I'm in Georgia. What am I going to find to read here? And there's a lot of stuff in Georgian and in Russian. Well, I do find things. And I find really fascinating things. And I got interested in Jan Willem de Wetering, Dutch writer of mysteries, because I found one of his books. I've never found that on, some sort of downloading service. You got to see and touch and taste the things. And so for me, that's really important, the physical nature of things. And we'll leave that there for now. I hope that helped Samantha. Okay, we're getting close to the end. A few questions on time. And Luke Thompson has a series, kind of a line of thought here. He says he wants to know how time relates to technique, the machine, and the scalability of good versus evil. He says, I've been thinking a lot about a comment that I made at some point in my conversation with Paul about time's relationship to love versus hate. Let's see. Anyway, he's interested in about technology, good and evil. And he says his intuition is that evil scales proportionately, good does not, if much at all. Now, of course, I did make a video on time and love and evil. And of course, Luke, I'm assuming you've probably seen that. And yeah, I would agree. It's much easier to do evil in mass than it is to do love and good in mass. That isn't to say it's impossible, but even the good, and I think the good can be done. For instance, I think that when the framers of the United States Constitution made that document, they made something that was, for the most part, a good. And it's a good that has affected the world for good. It still affects America for good. And they have affected an awful lot of people. They did not do that for instance, it would be almost impossible to imagine the same sort of thing happening today. That is, say, a country decides to reinvent its constitution. It puts its constitution online and everyone goes, oh my goodness, what a great idea. It's just hard to imagine such a thing happening today, which is why there's a certain kind of social justice leftist who wants to redo the Constitution to do all the inclusive things, and they are imagining somehow that the evil won't leak out from under that. It will suddenly correct all the problems. One of the reasons the U.S. Constitution works as an act for good is because of all the time they took to put it together. And likewise, why is the Bible predominantly, I mean, there will be people who will say the Bible is a book that has, created so much religious division and, so many people have killed each other in the name of God and such, to which I would say, I wouldn't really want to do a competition on whether so much people have killed each other more in the name of God or in the name of nothing, as in communism. The name of nothing has created quite a, the perfect society has killed far more people, because the idea of wanting a perfect society is pretty much an evil notion. That is to say, because whoever is going to put that in place is going to be the new gods. So I am wondering how technology, okay. So yeah, I think that evil, going along with entropy, it can just simply use things up more. So, as I mentioned before, the invention of almost any new technology leads to its dark side. And so, plastic bottles are great because, it's like you can now hand a little bottle to your kid and the kid will knock it off and it won't break. Wonderful. And just think of how much hell plastic bottles have caused us. and how do you fix the problem? So, for instance, I just read today that Europe is going to be doing away with single-use plastic, a lot of European countries, within a couple of years. Great. So what are you going to replace it with? And is that all the bottles, or is it just the paper bags or the plastic bags? Well, if it's bottles, you kind of only got one major source after that. Either you can create something you can use over and over again, and who wants to use plastic over and over again, or you can go back to glass. The problem is it's much easier. For instance, you think of one event, September 11th. That one event went around the world and created panic and fear. It is really hard to imagine a good event doing the same thing. For the same reason that good seems to work against entropy and evil seems to go with entropy. It's much easier to do evil. It's much easier simply by doing nothing to do evil. To do good requires thinking what really is good, which is why it's easier for artists today, to go back to the beginning of this discussion on art and such, to do kinds of evil in their strange, lackadaisical, ironic work, because to do good requires being the servant that Tarkovsky talks about, and that takes thought and time. And living in time, as I've pointed out many times before, is the name of the game. Hiding from time, pretending time doesn't exist, considering time an enemy, well, that doesn't work at all. I'm going to end with a question by Laura Giles. Also, your thoughts on Advent as a way of changing the experience of time. And I would say this, coming from a person who didn't have too much of a Advent tradition. That is to say, I was in the kinds of churches where they didn't light Advent candles, mostly because they were so independent that these kinds of aspects of the Christian calendar didn't matter too much. I guess I would say I came out of the tradition that takes Paul's law of liberty in Romans chapter 14 to be very powerful, where he says, one man regards a certain day above the others, while someone else considers every day alike. Each should be fully convinced in his own mind. And what was Paul saying about himself? I have the feeling he considered every day alike and was not the person who cared that much about the observances on special days. However, I would also say this. I think it's very important that I think the Advent, the Christian calendar is very important. And different traditions place different amounts of importance upon it. And I would not want to diminish any of that, especially in light of today's world, where pretty much every day is alike, and not in the way Paul was talking about. Every day is alike because it is another opportunity to shop. It's another opportunity to go online. It's another opportunity to, spend time with your phone. In other words, every day becomes the same. And then I think Advent, the Christmas season, the Easter season, even the Saints' days, which I have never been a particular subscriber to, given my traditions, are then become very important. And so I would ask you to consider the meaning found within the Christian calendar. And I'm still pondering these things for myself. And here I am in Georgia, where the Christian calendar is much, much more meaningful and relevant than in the world I came from in Alaska, even in the Protestant world, where I find that often we would do these little, light a Presbyterian church, they'd light a candle or something. It seemed kind of like kind of weak. Here, it's not weak, and that makes me rethink it. Well, anyway, I'm going to leave the questions there for now. We'll do this again sometime, maybe in a month or so. And thanks for being with me here on the Anadromist. And if you have other questions, you can put them down below. I'm not going to get to them, but if you have any comments, feel free to add to the discussion, or disagreements for that matter. I welcome it all. And so remember, like, subscribe. All these things are important. I'm trying to get a few more subscribers on here. So if you share this at all, that would be really helpful. If you want to get behind the paywall and get some of the other stuff that I have there will be a lot more musical related stuff back there eventually. But feel free to do that. And meanwhile, live the Anadromous life, swim against the stream, and thanks for spending time and asking questions. I really appreciated your questions. And we will meet again.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.